In July 1943, the Eastern Front was defined by the aftermath of the Battle of Kursk, a massive armored clash that had marked the end of Germany's strategic initiative in the East. Just days later, Soviet forces turned their gaze southward toward the Siversky Donets River, a geographic line of significance, having been contested repeatedly since the Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942. The river's banks formed both a natural barrier and a critical axis for movements in the Donbass and southern Ukraine German Army Group South, under command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, held the southern approaches with several armies. These included the XL Panzer Corps and LVII Panzer Corps, although armored strength was increasingly strained. For example, by the Izium-Barvenkovo offensive in July 1943, Army Group South had reduced complex armored resources, with individual panzer divisions fielding mostly infantry divisions and only minimal tank battalions. On the Soviet side, the Southwestern Front, led by General Rokossovsky, orchestrated an offensive beginning mid-July 1943 aimed at disrupting German positions along the Siversky Donets and linking to broader southern thrusts following Kursk. Forces included the 1st, 3rd, and 8th Guards Armies, backed by the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps and 23rd Tank Corps, which were held as mobile exploitation reserves. Soviet planning called for coordinated river crossing operations, supported by armored thrusts to establish bridgeheads and drive west into the rear of Army Group South. Strategically, the Donets region was vital for both sides. For Germany, it provided a buffer against Soviet penetration toward the Donbass or Kharkiv and offered the opportunity to threaten Soviet logistics. For the Red Army, forcing crossings here would open a new sector for operational flexibility and sustain pressure across multiple axes after Kursk. Soviet propaganda emphasized continuation of the Kursk offensive rhythm. German narratives continued to assert control of terrain, although intelligence underestimated Soviet offensive scale and intent public morale was shaped by the scale of Kursk's attrition. On the German side, units were exhausted, reserves were brittle, and armored entries limited. Soviet forces, though buoyed by Kursk, were likewise taxed, yet confident. Critically, partisan groups and local resistance added layers of complexity to supply and communication lines, further undermining German capacity to reinforce or reposition along the Donets. With both sides eyeing the Donets as the next angular battleground, forces were positioned to test the durability of river defenses and perhaps change the operational map in southern theater. By mid-July 1943, the Soviet Southwestern Front began the execution phase of its plan to force crossings over the Siversky Donets River. The first movements were initiated on 17 July, with reconnaissance in force probing German forward positions along a wide sector from Chuguyev to Izium. These preliminary attacks sought to identify the density and layout of German defenses, locate crossing points suitable for armor and mechanized infantry, and test the responsiveness of Axis artillery and reserves. German defensive forces along the sector consisted of elements of the 1st Panzer Army and the 8th Army, organized into local battle groups, Kampfgruppen, drawn from divisions such as the 17th Panzer, 23rd Panzer, and several infantry formations. These units were deployed in depth, with forward outposts directly on the river line, secondary defensive lines 3 to 5 kilometers to the rear, and mobile reserves stationed further west. The command structure for the defense was under Army Group South, with Field Marshal von Manstein coordinating sector boundaries to prevent breakthroughs from isolating major German formations in the Donbass. Soviet assault units prepared for the crossing by assembling pontoon bridges, assault boats, and rafts under camouflage cover. In key sectors, tank brigades assigned to the 23rd Tank Corps were ready to follow infantry across as soon as bridgeheads were established. The operational plan envisioned a rapid escalation from infantry probes to full-scale crossings within 48 hours, with massed artillery support up to 200 guns per kilometer in some breakthrough sectors designed to suppress German defensive fire and neutralize anti-tank positions before armor committed to the riverbanks. On the German side, initial reactions were constrained by uncertainty about Soviet intentions. While reconnaissance flights and ground reports indicated Soviet concentrations along the Donets, the scale of the buildup was interpreted by some German staff officers as preparation for diversionary attacks rather than a full offensive. As a result, several armored reserve units were held back from immediate redeployment to the threatened sectors, pending clearer intelligence. The first Soviet crossings on 18 July met with mixed results. In areas where German defenses were lightly held, Soviet infantry gained shallow lodgements on the western bank by nightfall, securing small perimeters suitable for ferrying over light equipment. In heavily defended stretches, however, German artillery and machine gun fire inflicted heavy casualties on assault troops, forcing repeated withdrawals and reassembly under cover of darkness. Notably, near Chugayev, German forward units used pre-registered artillery fire to destroy pontoon sections before they could be fully deployed, delaying Soviet armor from entering the fight on schedule. By the evening of 19 July, both commands recognized that the battle along the Siversky Donets was escalating beyond local engagements. Soviet commanders committed additional artillery and air support to expand the bridgeheads, while German higher command began redeploying panzer reserves southward to prepare for counterattacks aimed at eliminating the Soviet footholds before they could link into a broader offensive. The stage was set for the first major armored clashes west of the river since the end of the Kursk battle, with both sides aware that control of the crossings would dictate the tempo of operations in the southern sector for weeks to come. By 20 July, the 1st Guards Army, reinforced by the 8th Guards Army on its right flank, pushed to expand these footholds beyond the vulnerable riverbank zones. The plan required rapid consolidation of territory up to 5 to 7 kilometers inland to enable the construction of permanent bridging for heavy vehicles and armor. Soviet engineering units worked under near-constant artillery harassment to anchor pontoon sections and create improvised crossings, often shifting operations to nighttime to reduce losses from German observation and airstrikes. The 23rd Tank Corps, designated for the exploitation phase, began ferrying light tanks across on rafts while waiting for bridge completion. By midday, forward tank detachments were operating west of the river in some sectors, but in narrow corridors still vulnerable to counterattack. The Soviet armored advance was slowed by the need to traverse soft, shell-churned terrain that limited maneuver speed and exposed vehicles to German artillery and anti-tank guns sighted in depth. German command responded by ordering localized counterattacks aimed at compressing and, if possible, eliminating the Soviet bridgeheads before they reached operational depth. Elements of the 17th Panzer Division, supported by infantry from the 106th and 320th Infantry Divisions, launched assaults against the northernmost Soviet lodgements. In some areas, these efforts achieved temporary rollback of Soviet lines to the immediate riverbank, but the counterblows were costly. Limited reserves and the exhaustion of units recently engaged at Kursk reduced the German ability to sustain momentum once initial surprise was lost. Air operations played a critical role. The Luftwaffe committed available Stuka dive bomber formations to target Soviet pontoon sites and concentrations near crossing points. While these attacks destroyed several bridge sections and inflicted damage on supply columns, Soviet fighter cover and the sheer density of artillery on the eastern bank made it increasingly hazardous for German aircraft to operate at low altitude. Conversely, the Soviet Air Force concentrated Il-2 ground attack aircraft on suppressing German strongpoints and interdicting road movement of reserves toward the battle zone. Civilian impact was immediate in the river villages caught between shifting lines. Many residents fled under artillery fire, while others were pressed into service by either side for logistical tasks such as moving supplies, repairing roads, or guiding units through local terrain. The destruction of river ferries, piers, and storage depots by retreating forces deepened the disruption, making resupply dependent on newly established military infrastructure. By the close of 21st July, the tactical situation remained fluid. Soviet bridgeheads existed in at least three major sectors, each contested by German countermeasures. Neither side had yet achieved decisive control of the river corridor, but the momentum was beginning to shift. German commanders faced the prospect of committing more mobile reserves at the risk of weakening other parts of the southern front, while Soviet planners prepared to feed additional armored and mechanized units into the expanding lodgements, signaling that the fight along the Siversky Donets was far from a limited engagement. It was becoming a sustained battle for a key gateway into the Donbass. By 22nd July 1943, the intensity of fighting along the Siversky Donets River increased markedly as both sides committed additional forces in an effort to tilt the balance. Soviet command, recognizing that their bridgeheads were still vulnerable to concentrated counterattacks, ordered the rapid reinforcement of forward sectors with mechanized infantry and armor. And the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps began moving across hastily constructed pontoon bridges under cover of smoke screens, while artillery units intensified counter-battery fire to suppress German gun positions that had been targeting crossing sites since the operation's opening. German commanders, aware that allowing Soviet armor to break out from the bridgeheads would threaten operational collapse along the southern front, ordered immediate strikes by mobile reserves. Elements of the 23rd Panzer Division and 16th Panzer Grenadier Division were directed toward the most dangerous Soviet lodgements. In the northern sector near Protopopovka, these formations launched dawn assaults, supported by concentrated artillery and short-range Nebelwerfer rocket barrages. The attacks briefly halted The fighting quickly developed into a series of local armored engagements, often at ranges under 800 meters due to the constricted geography of the river valley and surrounding villages. Soviet T-34 units, benefiting from numerical superiority in some sectors, pressed countercharges to secure key ridgelines, while German Panzer IVs and self-propelled guns used reverse slope positions to maximize survivability. Losses mounted on both sides. Reports from the 23rd Tank Corps recorded over 40 tanks damaged or destroyed between 21 and 23 July, while German records indicated the loss of up to 25 armored vehicles in the same period. Air operations continued to be decisive. The Luftwaffe, despite strained resources, committed Ju-87 dive bomber wings to interdiction missions against Soviet pontoon traffic and supply concentrations east of the river. These missions achieved some success in delaying the arrival of heavy Soviet armor, but were increasingly challenged by dense anti-aircraft coverage and aggressive fighter sweeps by Yak-9s and La-5s. The Soviet Air Force, for its part, focused heavily on isolating the battlefield by bombing railway junctions and road convoys, feeding German reserves into the Donets sector. The local civilian population endured severe hardship. Villages along both banks were subjected to repeated shelling, and many structures were destroyed during street-to-street fighting as Soviet forward units attempted to clear German rearguard positions. Refugees fled toward areas deeper in Soviet-held territory, though some remained, either unable to evacuate or compelled to support military engineering efforts. German military authorities evacuated selected civilian groups from threatened areas to reduce the risk of intelligence leaks to the Red Army and to preserve local supply resources. By the close of 23 July, the tactical situation was one of attrition. The Soviets held multiple bridgeheads, each expanded to varying depths, but none yet linked into a continuous front. German defenders had blunted several breakout attempts, but at the cost of steadily depleting their mobile reserves. Both commands were now faced with a decision: whether to commit additional forces to force a decision in the Donets sector or to stabilize the lines and shift the fight to more favorable terrain elsewhere. The outcome of that decision would determine whether the Siversky Donets battle remained a costly stalemate or became a springboard for deeper offensive operations. By 24 July 1943, the operational tempo along the Siversky Donets had accelerated into a sustained battle of attrition, with both Soviet and German commands committing additional forces in an attempt to achieve a decisive advantage. The Soviet Southwestern Front directed reinforcements from the 1st Guards Tank Army into the northern bridgehead sectors, aiming to punch through toward strategic road junctions west of the river. These reinforcements included 2 tank brigades and supporting self-propelled artillery regiments, which began crossing under heavy protective barrages from artillery positioned on the eastern bank. German defense relied increasingly on mobile fire brigades, ad hoc armored groups formed from surviving Panzer IIIs, assault guns, and motorized infantry rotated between sectors to blunt Soviet thrusts. The 23rd Panzer Division, though reduced in strength after multiple counterattacks, was ordered to concentrate its remaining operational armor for a concentrated strike against the southernmost bridgehead near the village of Semyonovka. This counterattack, launched in the early hours of 25 July, managed to overrun several Soviet forward positions and destroy a dozen T-34s before meeting stiff resistance from newly arrived Soviet anti-tank units armed with ZIS-3 76.2 mm field guns. Artillery continued to dominate the battle space. Soviet fire missions, coordinated through forward observers embedded in assault companies, targeted German assembly areas and suspected supply dumps, disrupting the enemy's ability to mass for larger counteroffensives. Conversely, German artillery concentrated on isolating bridgeheads by destroying pontoons and temporary crossings, forcing the Soviets to divert engineering resources to constant repair and reconstruction. The struggle for air superiority remained evenly contested. The Luftwaffe managed to concentrate fighter and dive bomber sorties. However, limited fuel reserves and increasing Soviet fighter presence restricted their operational endurance. Soviet air units continued to deploy Il-2 ground attack aircraft in large formations, often escorted by Yak-9 fighters, to systematically suppress German defensive strongpoints and hinder reinforcement movements along the main lateral roads west of the river. Local geography influenced both the pace and style of operations. The riverbanks were steep in many areas, forcing assault units to cluster at a few viable crossing points, which in turn became predictable targets for German artillery. Marshy lowlands upstream complicated the movement of heavy vehicles, channeling much of the fighting into narrow corridors where armored clashes unfolded in confined terrain. By 26 July, the broader strategic picture began to emerge. While Soviet forces had expanded 2 of the bridgeheads to operational depth, they had not yet linked them into a single continuous front. German defenders were increasingly stretched, with reserve armor committed piecemeal to multiple threatened sectors. Both sides understood that the next phase, whether it came in the form of a Soviet breakout or a German coordinated counterstroke, would determine control over this key segment of the Donets Line and influence subsequent operations in the Donbass and southern Ukraine. By 27th of July 1943, the battle for the Siversky Donets sector had reached a point of sustained high-intensity combat with neither side yet able to secure an uncontested operational advantage. The Soviet High Command, determined to turn the bridgehead game, the 1st Guards Army and 8th Guards Army committed additional rifle divisions into the fight, supported by concentrated armor from the 23rd Tank Corps and self-propelled gun regiments. These units moved over recently reinforced pontoon bridges, some of which had been rebuilt twice in as many days after repeated German bombardments. German forces, recognizing the growing threat of a Soviet link-up between bridgeheads, sought to deliver sharp counterattacks before the Red Army could consolidate. The remnants of the 17th Panzer Division, reinforced with assault gun units from the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, launched a coordinated strike against the central lodgment near Zadishy. This operation, conducted with the support of Nebelwerfer rocket launchers and concentrated field artillery, inflicted heavy casualties on Soviet forward companies and temporarily forced a withdrawal from a newly seized ridge. However, German armor was met by a counter-concentration of Soviet anti-tank guns and direct fire support from Su-122 and Su-76 self-propelled artillery, halting the counterattack within hours. The struggle for air control persisted without a clear victor. Luftwaffe units continued to mount dive bomber raids against Soviet crossing points and ammunition depots east of the river. These strikes caused significant delays in fuel deliveries and temporarily limited tank operations on the western bank. In response, the Soviet Air Force increased the density of fighter patrols and intensified interdiction missions aimed at German reinforcement routes, particularly the road and rail lines feeding from Kharkiv and Sloviansk. Both sides suffered mounting aircraft losses, reducing sortie rates and forcing more selective targeting. Terrain constraints and weather added complexity to the operations. Heavy rains on 28 July turned low-lying fields near the river into mud traps, bogging down supply trucks and limiting the mobility of heavier tanks on both sides. This forced reliance on tracked supply carriers, horse-drawn transport, and localized stockpiling of ammunition and fuel. In the northern sector, Soviet engineers attempted to create corduroy roads across marshy areas to sustain armored advances, while German defenders fortified village strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire to counter expected assaults. Civilian life in the combat zone was marked by displacement and destruction. Villages within artillery range of the front were largely depopulated, with remaining residents either taking shelter in makeshift dugouts or evacuated by military authorities. In several instances, local civilians provided intelligence to either side, guiding troops through wooded areas or pointing out unguarded fords. Such activities prompted both Soviet and German commands to increase patrols and security sweeps in rear areas. By the end of July, the situation remained finely balanced. Soviet forces had secured more ground west of the Siversky Donets and expanded two bridgeheads into deeper salients, but German defenders still held key high ground positions and lateral communication routes. Both commands were preparing for the next phase, the Soviets aiming to mass sufficient force for a decisive breakout toward the Donbass, and the Germans seeking to concentrate their remaining mobile reserves for a counteroffensive capable of pushing the Red Army back across the river. The following days would determine whether the battle evolved into a strategic turning point or settled into a protracted engagement draining resources on both sides. In early August 1943, the Siversky Donets front entered a new and more complex phase as both Soviet and German commands attempted to adapt to the operational deadlock. The Soviet Southwestern Front, unwilling to lose the momentum gained over the previous 2 weeks, reorganized its forces for sustained pressure across multiple bridgeheads rather than risking a single concentrated blow that could be repelled. Fresh units, including the 33rd Guards Rifle Division and elements of the 7th Guards Mechanized Corps, were rotated into forward positions to relieve battle-worn formations. German forces likewise adjusted their posture. The 24th Panzer Corps, which had suffered heavy tank and personnel losses, received small numbers of replacement Panzer V's and assault guns from rear depots, but these were insufficient to restore pre-battle strength. Commanders shifted focus to holding key terrain features, particularly ridgelines and road junctions, that allowed flexible movement of reserves between sectors. This redeployment meant thinning out some sections of the front, a calculated risk to conserve manpower for counterattack capability. The nature of combat shifted toward attritional raids and localized offensives. Soviet night assaults became more frequent, aimed at seizing trench lines or fortified farmsteads before German artillery could be brought to bear. In response, German units intensified the use of pre-registered defensive fire plans and mounted immediate counterattacks with small armored detachments to retake lost ground before the Soviets could fortify it. This pattern of night seizure and daylight counteraction kept both sides in a state of near constant engagement. Artillery remained central to the battle's tempo. Soviet gunners massed fire on German rear area supply nodes and temporary fuel dumps, hoping to weaken the logistical backbone of the Panzer counterattack threat. German artillery, in turn, concentrated on disrupting Soviet bridging operations and ammunition supply lines. Despite repeated bombardments, Soviet engineers maintained a steady pace of bridge repair, often restoring damaged pontoons within hours. Air operations were marked by continued parity but diminishing intensity due to losses and mechanical attrition. Soviet Il-2 sorties struck German defensive belts, particularly around strongpoints such as Krasny Yar, while German Ju-87 and FW-190 fighter bombers targeted Soviet vehicle concentrations, awaiting commitment to the front. Each side's air force increasingly devoted sorties to interdiction of reinforcements, rather than direct battlefield support, reflecting the prolonged nature of the food stocks ran low, and the destruction of wells and grain stores, whether incidental or deliberate, forced many remaining villagers to flee deeper into rural areas or to Soviet-held towns across the river. German field security units conducted sweeps to detain suspected partisan sympathizers, while Soviet partisan detachments used the fluid front lines to infiltrate and gather intelligence on enemy dispositions. By 5th of August, the operational picture suggested a stalemate with localized Soviet advances offset by effective German tactical defense. However, Soviet pressure was slowly eroding German reserves, and the Red Army was beginning to prepare for a coordinated offensive that would link bridgeheads into a unified front. German planners recognized the danger, but faced constraints in both armor and manpower, making any large-scale counterstroke increasing. The stage was set for the next escalation, where attrition might finally tip the balance in favor of one side. By 7th of August 1943, both commands were operating under increasingly strained conditions along the Siversky Donets. The Soviet Southwestern Front had succeeded in marginally expanding the bridgeheads, but the tempo of operations was slowing under the weight of logistical and human exhaustion. Fresh reserves were still being fed into the fight, but these often arrived in incomplete formations, reflecting the accelerated commitment schedule demanded by the Stavka to maintain constant pressure. The 7th Guards Mechanized Corps, having fought in almost continuous contact for several days, was rotated into a quieter sector, while the 5th Guards Tank Army began concentrating for what was intended as a decisive push to link the northern and southern bridgeheads. German forces were also reconfiguring their defenses. The Yektifshir Panzer Corps and attached infantry divisions shifted to a defense-in-depth system, building secondary trench lines and fortifying villages further west to absorb any Soviet breakthrough. The 17th Panzer Division, now operating at less than 50% of its pre-battle strength in tanks, was reinforced with anti-tank battalions equipped with PaK-40 guns, positioned to cover likely avenues of Soviet armored advance. This restructuring was designed to offset the declining mobility of German armored forces with layered static defenses. The battlefield rhythm was increasingly dominated by localized assaults rather than sweeping maneuvers. Soviet infantry probes, supported by concentrated artillery barrages, would attempt to seize small but tactically valuable features such as crossroads, orchards, or riverbank high ground. These gains were often contested within hours by German counterattacks, typically involving company-sized armored elements backed. Such exchanges produced high casualty rates for minimal territorial change, but they wore down the combat capacity of both sides. Air support was intermittent and dictated by weather and resource constraints. Low cloud cover on 8 to 9 August limited the effectiveness of German dive bomber strikes, though occasional clear intervals allowed Luftwaffe fighter bombers to target Soviet pontoon bridges and troop concentrations. Soviet aviation exploited the same weather windows to mount concentrated Il-2 sorties against German artillery positions, attempting to suppress the heavy guns that were slowing Soviet infantry advances. Logistical strains became more acute. Soviet supply columns, operating over makeshift roads subject to constant German interdiction, struggled to maintain steady deliveries of ammunition and fuel to forward units. German logistics, relying on fewer but more secure supply routes, faced the challenge of resupplying dispersed defensive positions under constant artillery harassment. The destruction of a key bridge on a lateral road west of the river forced the Germans to reroute supplies over longer distances, reducing the frequency of resupply runs. Civilians remained trapped in contested zones, with reports of entire hamlets being abandoned after repeated shelling. German rear area security detachments intensified sweeps for partisan elements believed to be relaying troop movement information to the Soviets. Meanwhile, Soviet partisan groups increased sabotage of German communication lines, further complicating coordination between frontline units and higher command. By 10th or August, the operational situation was one of mutual attrition. Soviet forces still held the initiative in terms of offensive activity, but their progress was incremental, while German defenses, though under constant pressure, continued to absorb and repulse assaults. Both sides recognized that the decisive moment was approaching. The Soviets aiming to achieve a breakthrough before their attacking formations were depleted, and the Germans hoping to hold long enough to stabilize the front and prepare a coordinated counteroffensive. The next major commitment of reserves would likely determine which vision prevailed. By 12th of August 1943, the fighting along the Siversky Donets had entered a decisive but extremely costly phase. The Soviet command committed its remaining operational reserves to attempt a unified breakout from multiple bridgeheads, with the aim of seizing a continuous strip of territory on the western bank and forcing the German front into retreat. The 5th Guards Tank Army spearheaded the central thrust, advancing in conjunction with infantry from the 8th Guards Army. Supporting artillery concentrations reached their highest density yet, with over 200 guns and multiple rocket launcher regiments firing preparatory barrages over a 20-minute span before the assault. German defenders reacted by concentrating their remaining mobile forces at critical points. Elements of the 6th Panzer Division, brought down from a quieter sector, joined with the remnants of the 17th Panzer Division to form ad hoc Kampfgruppen tasked with immediate counterattacks against Soviet penetrations. Anti-tank defenses were reinforced with additional 88mm guns positioned on high ground to cover likely armored approach routes. The German defense plan relied on allowing limited Soviet penetration before sealing off the gap with armored counterblows. The initial Soviet advance made notable gains, overrunning several forward German positions and capturing small but strategic villages near the river crossing sites. However, progress slowed as Soviet tanks encountered well-prepared kill zones, where overlapping fields of fire from concealed anti-tank guns inflicted heavy losses. In some sectors, entire Soviet companies were reduced in minutes, forcing commanders to divert armor into less favorable terrain. Air support was intense on both sides. Soviet ground attack aircraft flew concentrated sorties against German artillery positions, while the Luftwaffe committed nearly all available fighter bombers to striking Soviet armored spearheads. The air battle was marked by fierce dogfights over the river and rapid shifts in air superiority during the day. Damage to pontoon bridges from repeated bombing raids further complicated Soviet logistics, slowing reinforcement, and the German defensive line bent but did not break. Counterattacks launched on the evening of 12th August succeeded in recapturing several forward positions and isolating pockets of Soviet troops west of the main bridgeheads. Soviet units in these isolated positions fought to hold until nightfall, when engineers attempted to extract them under cover of darkness. Some units managed to cross back to the eastern bank. Others were forced to abandon vehicles and heavy equipment. Civilian presence near the combat zones was now minimal, with most non-combatants having fled earlier in the month. Abandoned settlements were used by both armies as supply dumps or fortified positions. Partisan groups continued to operate in the rear areas, sabotaging German communication lines, but the intensity of the frontline battle limited their immediate impact on the main. While territorial gains were achieved, they were limited and came at the cost of significant armored and infantry losses. The German defense had absorbed the heaviest blow yet in the sector, but at the expense of exhausting much of its remaining reserve strength. Both sides now faced the reality that the next stage of the battle would be fought with depleted forces and mounting logistical strain, setting the conditions for the concluding phase of the Siversky Donets campaign. By mid-August 1943, the battle for control along the Siversky Donets had reached its closing phase. After nearly 3 weeks of sustained combat, the Soviet Southwestern Front had failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, while German forces, though retaining much of the contested western bank, were depleted to a point that further large-scale counteroffensives were no longer feasible. Both commands recognized that the operational balance now. Soviet forces held several bridgeheads west of the river, though many were shallow and vulnerable to artillery fire from German-held heights. Engineers worked continuously to improve fortifications, dig communication trenches, and stockpile supplies in preparation for renewed offensives in the autumn. The Red Army Command used the lull to rotate battered formations to rear areas, bringing in fresher rifle divisions to stabilize the front. Intelligence assessments indicated that while the Germans had retained key terrain, their armored strength in the sector had been reduced to fewer than 80 operational tanks, a fraction of the force at the start of the campaign. The Germans likewise adapted their posture. Orders from higher command emphasized holding existing positions with minimal offensive action, preserving combat power for other threatened sectors. Many defensive positions were reconfigured into strongpoints anchored on villages, connected by barbed wire, mines, and interlocking fields of fire. Infantry units reinforced by assault gun detachments became the primary means of frontline defense. The Luftwaffe, with limited aircraft available, focused almost exclusively on reconnaissance and interdiction of Soviet supply routes. The civilian landscape on both sides of the river had been transformed. Villages were depopulated, agricultural land lay untended, and the destruction of infrastructure, bridges, wells, mills, made the return of residents unlikely in the near term. Soviet authorities began organizing relief and resettlement efforts in liberated zones, while German rear area commands requisitioned whatever resources remained in their control for military use. Partisan rail lines leading into the sector were repeatedly damaged, forcing the Germans to divert engineering units from the front to repair them. In some cases, these partisan actions had greater cumulative effect on German logistics than the direct fighting along the river. By 18th August, a de facto pause had settled over much of the front. Small-scale raids and artillery duels persisted, but neither side was in a position to mount a major assault. The Soviets had gained modest territorial expansion and established a foundation for future offensives, while the Germans had denied them the operational breakthrough that might have destabilized the front entirely. The battle's outcome was a costly stalemate, with both armies suffering heavy personnel and equipment losses. For the Soviets, the fight demonstrated their growing capacity to sustain offensive operations over extended periods, even without immediate strategic results. For the Germans, it underscored the increasing difficulty of defending long front lines with diminishing reserves. The Siversky Donets engagement faded into relative obscurity compared to larger operations of the Eastern Front, but its local consequences were lasting, shaping the tactical possibilities